Okay, it's a minute after the hour. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening. My name is Professor Brian Henning, and as chair of the Environmental Studies Department at Gonzaga University, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event this evening. Before we get started, just a quick bit about Zoom in case you aren't like us professors who are sort of living our lives on Zoom these days. I have made it so that you are not able to unmute yourself at the moment. And you can chat with the host, especially during the talk. During the Q&A, we will relax that a little bit. Please notice that this evening we're recording this event, and within a week or so, you should be able to find it on the Gonzaga Environmental Studies events website under past events. During the Q&A, I will make it possible for you to selectively unmute yourself or post a question in the chat. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to bring to your attention the other virtual events that we're hosting this semester. On March 19th, the Gonzaga Environmental Studies Department will be hosting climate activist Grace Hope at noon. And then on March 23rd and 24th in the afternoon, we're honored to co-host with the Gonzaga Law School and the Washington State Attorney General's Office a symposium on environmental justice, race, poverty, and the environment. All of these events are free and open to the public. You can find details at the link that I'm posting in the chat to everyone at gonzaga.edu/ENVS events. That's gonzaga.edu/ENVS events. Tonight, we're very happy to host Dr. John Cook to discuss how to fight fake news about climate change. John Cook is a research assistant professor at the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University. His research focuses on understanding and countering misinformation about climate change with an emphasis on using critical thinking to build resilience. He founded Skeptical Science and authored the book Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change, combining climate science, critical thinking, and cartoons to explain how we can counter climate misinformation. He also co-authored the college textbooks Climate Change, Examining Facts about Climate Change and Climate Science, in Modern Synthesis, and also the book Climate Change Denial, Heads in the Sand. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor John Cook.
Thanks very much, Brian. I'll share my slides now. Fingers crossed everything works okay. See that okay? All right, great. Excellent. All right, so what I want to talk about tonight, well, tonight for me, I guess it's late afternoon for you over there, is I want to start by talking about some of my research and other people's research into understanding misinformation, particularly climate misinformation, and how to respond to it. And then finally, I want to talk about a particular solution that I've been working on that tries to put into practice all this psychological research and critical thinking research. So to begin with, I want to talk about the problem of misinformation and how does misinformation do damage? Because you really need to understand how misinformation does damage in order to come up with solutions that effectively prevent that damage. And there are a number of different ways that misinformation can do damage to both people and society in general. Some of the obvious things is misinformation can cause people to believe wrong things. It can have a polarizing influence on society. It can reduce people's trust in institutions or in science. But I want to talk about a very specific and I think one of the most insidious and dangerous ways that misinformation does damage. And to demonstrate that, I want to talk about some research that was published in 2017 by Sander van der Linden and some of my colleagues at George Mason and Yale University. And what they did was they ran an experiment where they tested what happens when people are exposed to different forms of information, conflicting pieces of information. One of the pieces of information they showed people was the 97% consensus amongst climate scientists that humans are causing global warming. So basically just communicating the scientific consensus change. Another piece of information or misinformation that they showed people was an excerpt from a website called the Global Warming Petition Project. And this website features 31,000 plus science graduates who have signed a petition stating that humans aren't disrupting climate. The point of this website is basically to argue that all these people have signed this petition, therefore there's no scientific consensus on climate change. So what the researchers did was they showed people either one of these pieces of information or the other or both, and then measured what the effect was. And this was the effect. This shows the change in perceived consensus. In other words, they asked people what they thought the consensus was. But they found similar results with general climate attitudes as well. And what they found was the first group here, the bar on the left, was the group who were shown just the 97% consensus. This had a strong, significant positive effect. When you tell people that there's an overwhelming consensus on climate change, that has a positive effect on people's acceptance of climate change, as well as their support for climate action. The second group, second bar here, was showing just the misinformation, the Global Warming Petition Project. And with this group, when they were shown just the misinformation, it had a significant negative effect. So it reduced their perceptions of consensus, but it also reduced their climate attitudes and their support for climate action. So misinformation does work. It can not only reduce people's perceptions and their climate literacy, but it also can reduce support for climate action as well. The third group, this third bar here, we're shown both the fact and the myth. And what the researchers found was that the two cancelled each other out. When people were presented with both fact and misinformation, and they weren't told, well, this is the fact, this is the misinformation. They're just shown different screens of information. People ended up not changing their belief at all. And what's happening here is when people are shown conflicting pieces of information and they have no way of resolving that conflict, it's a bit like those old episodes of Star Trek where Captain Kirk gets cloned and you have the real Kirk and the fake Kirk, and Mr. Spock has to try to figure out which is the real and which is the fake. When people don't know how to resolve that conflict, they don't know how to discern fact versus myth, the danger is that they disengage and that they end up just believing neither. And this is the real insidious danger of misinformation. It's not just that it can cause people to believe wrong things. Misinformation doesn't have to be based on evidence or data or coherent or even convincing. Sometimes it just has to exist and it can cancel out factual information. This has a big consequence for scientists and educators and anyone doing public engagement about issues like climate change or other scientific issues, because it means that even if we are trying, we work hard to make sure that our communication is accurate and it's well designed to be clear and engaging with people, all those efforts can be cancelled out by misinformation. However, there is what the researchers also did was explore ways to try to neutralize the misinformation. And in order to do that, they drew on a branch of psychological research called inoculation theory. This is research going back to the 1950s. And what psychology researchers have found is if you expose people to a weakened form of misinformation that can build up people's immunity, their resistance or their resilience, so that when they encounter the actual misinformation, it no longer has a misinforming effect. It doesn't influence them. And so they're really borrowing that idea of vaccination, exposing people to a weakened form of the misinformation, or in the case of vaccination, a weakened form of a virus, in order to build up immunity to the actual virus, or in this case, the actual misinformation. So what do I mean by a weakened form of misinformation? In the case of this experiment, what they did was they delivered the misinformation in weakened form by explaining the different ways that the misinformation was misleading. Here is an excerpt of the inoculating text. So this is just part of it. But what this inoculating text did was several things. Firstly, it explained how, because this was an online petition, anyone could fill it out. And so many of the names on the petition that were just obviously fake names. There was people who'd been dead for a long time. There were Star Wars characters from MASH, members of Spice Girls. So it was very low quality control on the petition. Secondly, because it was anyone with a science degree, although 31,000 seems like a really large number, there are millions of people with science degrees in the US, and 31,000 is a tiny fraction of that total community of science graduates. So it's making this number seem really big when it's actually a tiny percentage. And thirdly, because anyone with a science degree could sign the petition, there were people from a whole range of different fields of science, many of which had nothing to do with climate science at all. There were science graduates who had degrees in computer science, or veterinary science, medical science, engineering, but less than 0.1% of all the signatories had actual expertise in climate science. So what the researchers found was when people were inoculated before being shown the misinformation, they found that it mostly neutralized the misinformation and allowed the facts to have a positive effect again. And so the conclusion that the researchers came to was that inoculating people, preemptively exposing them to weakened forms of misinformation, was an effective way to neutralize the misinformation. The problem is that inoculation only inoculated them against that one specific myth. So you can't bombard people with a million inoculations, inoculating them against every possible myth. So that's one of the big challenges of inoculation. Now, while Sander van der Linden and his colleagues were doing this research, at the same time, I was in Australia doing my PhD, and I was researching the very same topic, looking at ways to inoculate people against misinformation. But I took a slightly different approach to the earlier research. I coincidentally, not even knowing that this study, that Sander was running his study, my study was using the same misinformation. And it seems coincidental, but actually since then in hindsight, it turns out that the Global Warming Petition Project is one of the most potent climate myths there is in terms of reducing public perceptions about climate change. So like I actually had done a few different experiments with different climate myths, and I found that this was one of the most effective in reducing people's climate perceptions, which is bad from a society point of view, but from an experiment point of view, it helps you to get measurable effects. And what I found was when I showed people this climate misinformation, it had a significant negative effect. This, in fact, was pretty much the same effect that Sander got. Overall, it reduced people's perceived consensus by about 10%. But interestingly, the horizontal axis in this graph is political ideology. People on the left are more left-wing, people to the right of the graph are more right-wing. And what I found was climate misinformation has a disproportionate effect depending on people's political ideology. The more politically conservative people were, the stronger the effect that the misinformation had in reducing their climate perceptions. That's not to say that conservatives in general are more susceptible to misinformation. It's just the case with climate change, that climate misinformation does have a stronger effect on political conservatives. So in my experiment, the next thing I did was for a different group in my experiment, I showed them an inoculating message. But there was a big difference between my inoculation and the earlier experiment. I didn't mention the Global Warming Petition Project at all in my inoculation. Instead, what I did was I talked about the technique of fake experts, otherwise known as argument from false authority. People who convey the impression of expertise, but didn't have the relevant expertise. And what I found, and as well as explaining that general technique of fake experts, I also used tobacco as an analogy. they've been using this technique going back to the mid-20th century as a way of casting doubt on the scientific consensus that smoking causes cancer and other health impacts. What I found with this blue line here was that inoculating people against the general technique of fake experts neutralized that technique when it was used in the global warming petition project. So without even mentioning the global warming petition project, I was able to inoculate people against that myth by explaining that general technique used in it. Don't be put off by that slight slope in the line. Statistically, this is equivalent to zero. It's like a horizontal line from a statistical point of view. What it means is that the misinformation across the political spectrum, whether people are liberal or conservative, nobody wants to be misled. And so explaining the rhetorical techniques used to mislead neutralizes those techniques across the political spectrum. So my work since doing that initial inoculation research has been exploring, well, how do you put inoculation into practice? How do you explain the techniques of science denial in order to inoculate people against science misinformation? And what I found really helpful is the FLIC framework, FLIC being the 5 techniques of science denial: fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. And so a lot of my work has been on developing the FLIC framework and then experimenting with different ways of explaining it to people. And what I want to do next is just give you some examples of these 5 denial techniques in the case of climate misinformation, just to make it a bit more concrete. It's all been a bit abstract and theoretical up to this point. First, I wanted to look at fake experts. So as I said earlier, these are people who either have no expertise or have irrelevant expertise, but are portrayed as having expertise as a way of convincing the general public that they're a source of credible information. Now, in general life, we don't accept people who have irrelevant expertise when it comes to important issues. You wouldn't want a computer scientist performing heart surgery on you. But that's exactly what happens with climate change. You have people who don't have expertise in climate science, but they're talking about really complicated climate science and often are very convincing to the general public. Fake experts are one of the most convincing or persuasive forms of misinformation. And so, as we've seen twice now, the Global Warming Petition Project is a very prominent example of this technique. But we also see it in other issues as well, not just in climate change or in tobacco. We see it across many different issues. And just over the last year, we saw almost exactly the same thing as the Global Warming Petition Project, but applied to COVID. And there was a big petition, over 700,000 people signing this petition, and a small number of scientists with the relevant expertise, a much larger number of scientists with not the same level of relevance to doing epidemiological research. And what this petition was doing was casting doubt on the mainstream consensus of the medical community about how to address COVID, how to stop it from spreading, whether it's masks or social distancing or shutting down society in order to temporarily stop the virus from spreading. And this is exactly the same strategy that was used in the Global Warming Petition Project. The second denial technique is logical fallacies. And generally speaking, a logical fallacy is an argument where the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. Every argument consists of one or more premises or starting assumptions, followed by a conclusion. But if the conclusion doesn't logically follow from the premises, then it's a logical fallacy. So it's also known as a non sequitur, which is Latin for it does not follow. I think that's what it is. My Latin's a bit rusty. Now, let me give you a very simple example of a logical fallacy. In this argument, the premise is I have blue eyes. The conclusion is I know quantum physics. And obviously the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. Whether I have blue eyes or not has nothing to do with my knowledge of quantum physics. It does not follow. So there are a number of different logical fallacies. It's quite a broad umbrella. And in climate misinformation, we see false dichotomies, we see ad hominem attacks, we see red herrings. But the one I want to focus on is one of the most common logical fallacies found in climate misinformation. And it's the argument that the reason why climate is changing now is because climate has been changing naturally throughout Earth's history. In other words, the premise is climate has changed naturally in the past, and the conclusion is therefore climate must be changing naturally now. Now, the logic of this argument is exactly the same as finding a obvious murder victim, someone with a knife sticking out of their back, and arguing, well, people have died of natural causes in the past, so this person must have died of natural causes now. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. Just because people have died naturally in the past doesn't mean that everyone who dies now must have died from that same cause as well. The argument commits single cause fallacy. And it's exactly the same logic as the argument that natural climate change in the past must mean that what's happening now must be natural as well. The third denial technique is impossible expectations. This involves demanding unrealistic standards of proof from science before acting on it. This is a technique that the tobacco industry perfected in the mid 20th century, demanding ever higher levels of proof that smoking caused cancer in order to delay regulations of the tobacco industry. And what this technique often does is draw upon a misconception that people have about science. They tend to think that science provides exact answers, when it never does. Science always provides a range of estimated values, whether it's with measurements or with predictions. But science deniers often exploit that misunderstanding about how science works in order to demand impossible expectations and delay action. And we see that fallacy, that denial technique can be quite dangerous, because often scientists know that something bad is coming down the road. They just don't know exactly how bad it's going to be or exactly when it's going to happen. But demanding that we know exactly how bad it's going to be can delay action to avoid that impact until it's too late. The fourth denial technique is cherry picking. This involves focusing on a small piece of the puzzle while ignoring the full picture. And it's like being on the bow of a sinking ship and arguing, well, I'm moving upwards, therefore the ship can't be sinking. They're only looking at their immediate situation and ignoring the bigger picture. And you can tell when someone is cherry picking if the conclusion that they come to from their evidence that they're citing is different to the conclusion you would come to by looking at the full body of evidence. Let me just wait a second, wait till we get right under the water. All right, so let me give you an example of a climate cherry pick. So when we look at the surface temperature record over the last half century or so, we see a distinct long-term warming trend. But when you look closely at the surface temperature record, you see that it jumped up and down quite violently from year to year as the oceans exchange heat with the atmosphere. This up and down from year to year means that it's possible to cherry pick any time throughout a long-term warming trend where the temperature looks like it's just flat or maybe even going down slightly if you're very careful in cherry picking the right short period. So this animated GIF shows that throughout the entire warming trend, you could say that there's never global warming during any of those times because there is always a short blue line where it appears that the temperature isn't going up. But that's just another example of cherry picking to avoid the bigger picture. The last denial technique is conspiracy theories. When there's a global scientific community who agree on when the scientific consensus on something like human-caused global warming, but you disagree with that, you don't think that human-caused global warming is happening, how do you explain the scientific consensus? Either all the world's scientists are accidentally wrong in that same direction, or they're all conspiring to mislead and deceive the public. Now, unfortunately, science deniers always end up landing on that second conclusion. Science denial and conspiracy theories go hand in hand. Here's an example of a climate conspiracy theory posted by the former president. And it's kind of amusing, right? Conspiracy theories are often extreme and ridiculous. And when you really think through the implications, if it was really true, it doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, the concept of global warming dates back to Joseph Fourier in the early 1800s, and then was shown the greenhouse effect was shown in a lab in the 1850s by John Tyndall. Then you had Svante Arrhenius in Sweden publishing climate or research into global warming at the turn of the 20th century. So the concept of global warming has been around a long time, and to argue that it's a conspiracy theory obviously is utterly implausible and kind of amusing in a way. But we must never forget that conspiracy theories, as ridiculous as they are, can have really serious impacts on society. And we see that more than ever over the last month. We've seen how conspiracy theories about elections resulted in violence and death. And even if it doesn't get that extreme, just general conspiracy theories, even just posted on the internet, can result in people reducing their trust in institutions, their trust in science, and it can also reduce people's intent to engage with politics or even engage in environmental behaviour. It can have very subversive and insidious effects on people's attitudes and behaviour. So conspiracy theories can be quite serious and damaging. So those are the 5 techniques of science denial. And really these 5, the flick, are just the tip of the iceberg, really. Over the last decade, I've been developing a taxonomy of all the different denial techniques. And it's still not comprehensive. I've still got a lot of work to do, but already it's getting quite comprehensive and a bit overwhelming for people. And so that's a challenge from a communication and education point of view. If the purpose of, or if the way to inoculate people against misinformation is to help build their awareness of all the different techniques used to mislead, they have to not only become aware of all these techniques, they have to understand them and be able to apply them in the wild, be able to recognize them when they see them. And that is a big communication and education challenge. So while most of my research has been doing lab experiments, exploring more effective ways to explain logical fallacies, I've also been coming up against 3 big challenges in terms of actually applying all this research in the real world. How can you actually practically implement inoculation and build people's resilience and critical thinking in the real world amongst the general public in a way that could potentially actually shift the needle and reduce the effectiveness of misinformation. And I want to quickly talk about 3 of these challenges that I've been facing that my lab experiments haven't really been able to answer. The first is psychological. Teaching critical thinking is hard because critical thinking is hard. Our brains are hardwired for mostly fast thinking, just quick, instant reactions. We have all these mental shortcuts that help us to come to decisions instantly. Often they work, but they also make us vulnerable to being misled and misinformed. And so to really avoid that, we need to employ critical thinking, which is slow, effortful thinking. It's harder for us to do it. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult. So that's the first psychological challenge. The second challenge is structural. Society is becoming more polarized and siloed. We get our information from social media, which only delivers to us information that it knows from its algorithms that we want to read. We on social media and in real life, we tend to hang out with people who believe what we believe. And in mainstream media, we tend to just watch cable channels or radio shows that tend to just, again, tend to present a point of view that's more consistent with our beliefs. So how, even if you come up with the perfect inoculating message, how do you penetrate those siloed communities? It's a big communication challenge. And the third challenge is social. I kind of alluded to this earlier, like we saw with my research that political ideology has a big influence on people's vulnerability to misinformation. And more generally, climate change is deeply polarized. The biggest predictor of people's attitudes about climate change is their political affiliation, what tribe they identify with, their social identity. Humans are social animals. And that means that in the case of climate change, people who are politically conservative are more vulnerable to misinformation, but it's also harder to communicate climate change information to people who are already resistant to it and tend to actually double down on their beliefs when presented information that threatens their social identity. So these are the three challenges. And now I just want to talk about very quickly, I hope I haven't been talking for a while, but I'm nearly finished. I want to talk about a solution that I've been working on over the last 2 years that puts all this inoculation and critical thinking research into practice using gamification. And while I was working on this, it slowly dawned on me that games, critical thinking games, could potentially solve all three of these communication challenges. The game is Cranky Uncle, and what it does is it teaches you those techniques of science denial. You see that the screen on the right here is the 5 techniques of science denial, flick. But the way the game works is using humor and cartoons. It has a Cranky Uncle character who mentors you into how to become a science-denying Cranky Uncle yourself as you play the game. But really what it's doing is explaining the techniques used to mislead so that you build up your resistance or resilience against being misled. So the way the game works is, firstly, the uncle explains different techniques of science denial and uses lots of analogies in cartoon form as a way of demonstrating flawed logic. But then what the game does is it gets you practicing critical thinking. It shows you examples of misinformation, and you have to identify the denial technique in the misinformation, and then you practice that over and over and over again. And the game gives you, like, you earn cranky points for each quiz that you do, and level up. And it uses all those techniques of gameplay, leveling up and point scoring and humor as well, as a way to incentivize players to get further into the game. Because the longer people play the game, the more they practice spotting fallacies and practice critical thinking. And this is where the game, or gamification in general, has a potential to overcome that first psychological challenge. Because critical thinking is hard, it's this slow thinking, effortful process. By practicing it over and over and over again, it gradually converts that slow, difficult process into a quick, effortless process. It makes critical thinking more instinctive and second nature and effortless. So that's how the game uses gamification to overcome that psychological barrier. Basically, we all have mental shortcuts or heuristics that make us vulnerable to misinformation. but by practicing critical thinking, we gradually replace all those bad heuristics with good heuristics. The second challenge is structural. How do you reach siloed communities in a polarized society? As I was explaining this game to climate scientists, what really struck me over the couple of years that I was developing it was how enthusiastic climate scientists were to use the game in the classes that they taught. And I found, without even really trying, that there were teachers across the country who were interested in testing the game in their classrooms. Red states and blue states in Texas and Utah and West Virginia, and as well as California and Massachusetts. So over the last couple of weeks, I developed a teacher's guide to make it easier for teachers to use the game in their classroom, as well as a whole couple of pages of suggestions for classroom activities to go with the game. And what I found was, just in a couple of weeks, teachers from all over the country, from red states and blue states, were already signing up to use the game. And what really surprised me was it wasn't just climate science and environmental science classes. It was classes across a whole range of subjects: English, math, chemistry, biology, physics, critical thinking, philosophy, psychology. There's critical thinking is relevant to every subject, and misinformation is found in every subject. So learning the techniques used to mislead is applicable no matter what subject teacher is covering. The third thing is social, that tribality, the fact that depending on what tribe people belong to, those tribal instincts can make them more vulnerable to misinformation. This kind of came out of nowhere, but just over the last few weeks, someone from Ohio approached me and said that they wanted to challenge a nearby town to a cranky contest. The idea was that their town would try to build up as many cranky points as they could, and challenge the other town to see whether they could get as many cranky points as they could on Earth Day, which is coming up in April, I think. And so this is something we're setting up at the moment, is a way to group everyone, like track everyone within belonging to a certain group, and then have different groups compete with each other. And what this does is it appeals to people's tribal instincts, but rather than the tribal instincts making them vulnerable to misinformation, the tribal instinct is incentivizing them to play the game and build up their resilience so that they're less vulnerable to misinformation. So we're yet to test this out, but my instinct is, or my hope is, that this is a third way that gamification can overcome one of those big, what I thought was an insurmountable challenge to addressing misinformation. That's all I wanted to talk about. There's lots more resources if you're interested in diving into this deeper. On crankyuncle.com, not only do I have a link to download the game on either Android or iPhone or playing it in a browser, I also blog a lot about this research, about critical thinking and about the psychology of debunking. So you can get lots more information about climate misinformation and critical thinking in general there. And lastly, last fall semester, I taught a class here at George Mason University on understanding and countering climate misinformation. And because it was a virtual class, I created a lot of videos about the psychology of debunking and climate misinformation and critical thinking. You can check out all those videos on my YouTube channel, and here's just a short URL to help you find it more easily. I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to answer anyone's questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cook. This is really, really interesting. So in the chat, I posted some suggestions for how we could proceed. I'd like to invite especially and first our Gonzaga students to ask a question. You can do that by going to the reactions button at the bottom and clicking raise hand, or if you'd prefer, you could post a question in the chat and then I can read that out. At the moment, you're not able to unmute yourself.
And are only changing now because suddenly it's a reality. So you're really change yourself.
Apologies. At least I thought you weren't able to. And so if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. I'm going to go ahead and start while you're thinking of questions that you might have. Dr. Cook, how would you respond to someone who says that you're not really inoculating people against misinformation, you're indoctrinating them to your own views?
Well, I have been accused of that. So what I'm doing is the opposite of indoctrination. I'm teaching people how to critically assess arguments. And so whether the argument, regardless of what political side it comes from or the agenda of the person, our general ability to assess arguments is crucially important for everyone. So yeah, this is really building resilience against indoctrination.
Excellent. Any questions from students here? It's a good chance to ask Dr. Cook a question provoked by his talk here. And if not, I invite the rest of you to feel free to raise your hand in the reactions button at the bottom or to post something in the chat. I see Dr. Gordon there. Jeremy Gordon, do you have a thought for tonight? You're kind enough to have your video on too, so I can actually see you as a communication studies professor. I'm curious if you feel like any of the information that Dr. Cook has been presenting would be useful in your classes. Just to put you on the spot, my friend. Oh yeah, well, raise your hand and I can take you off. I gotta unmute you. No, you're good? All right, I tried. Oh, there you go. There you go. I can, does that work?
Yep, there we go. Thank you for that. I really appreciate the use of humor as a way to engage different audiences. So I was thinking about that in relation to classes in communication, but also the form of the game itself and how the game could possibly, it seems like there's the chance that the playfulness and playing the game might lessen defenses or bring latent ideologies up front, and then you can wrestle with them. That always tends to happen when I play games in class. But I actually do have a quick question, if that's okay as well. So at the beginning, there was this distinction between fact, myth, and misinformation. And I'm wondering how you might explain the differences between myth and misinformation, or if you do see a distinction.
Not really, other than myth is a specific instance of misinformation. Yeah, I'm probably careless in my terminology, but I use myth as just an example, and misinformation as a phenomenon in general. But just to follow up on your humor comment, yeah, I've been, the reason I started going down the humor route was because working with some critical thinking philosophers to develop a critical thinking methodology for deconstructing misinformation, they introduced me to the approach of parallel argumentation, which is taking flawed logic and transplanting it into a parallel analogous situation. And the more absurd it being, the more clear often the original logical fallacy was. And I realized that that's what late night comedians did all the time as a way to you know, public figure just said this, well, that's just like being in this situation. And it was a very accessible and engaging way to communicate fallacies and debunk misinformation. And so we started experimenting with using humor and digging into the literature into humor as a science communication tool. And it's quite fascinating that there are a lot of benefits to humor as a science or public engagement tool. but it seems like every benefit almost has a kind of a drawback as well. Like a serious issue like climate change does make people more conducive to listening to the message. So humor is kind of a way of breaking down that barrier, but it also makes them take the issue less seriously. So there's a kind of a trade-off there. And similarly, you mentioned how it kind of makes people like less likely to counter-argue, which is a good thing. Like humorous messages are experienced counter-arguing, but it also means that people take the message less seriously as well. Like they don't give it this level of consideration that a non-humorous message is. Yeah. So what I'm trying to do often with my humorous kind of public engagement is try to grab the benefits while avoiding the seeming like negative drawback that goes with them. Just trying to have my cake and maybe that's a bad analogy, but yeah, just trying to glean all the benefits and dodge all the drawbacks.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of an argument put forth in, I can't remember the author. The book is called Bad Environmentalism, Irony and Irreverence in the Ecological Age, Nicole Seymour. And the argument that Seymour makes is that irony, irreverence, right, imperfect or ambivalent, perhaps even mythic or not necessarily truly factual, I guess, information opens up possibilities for more people to engage without expert knowledge, rather than like coming to the table with expert knowledge first. And then, because that also seems to have an impact on just the number of people who can engage. And so this irony, irreverence, and maybe you can respond to this, right? Do you think it opens up the possibility to get around the expertise trap, or does it, like you said, does the risk outweigh the benefit of engagement, regardless of what kind of engagement that is?
Well, I don't think the risk outweighs the benefit, or I wouldn't be spending so much time working on it. But I mean, that sounds like an interesting book. I'll have to track that one down. If you could post the actual title into the comments, I might just copy and paste it for searching later. Like certainly, like another benefit of humorous public engagement is it does have the biggest impact on disengaged audiences, like people who are disengaged on whatever the issue that the message is about. So, I mean, that's one experimental finding. Another thing that makes a lot of sense to me is that the parallel argumentation approach, this is a very specific application, but one power of that approach is it allows you to sidestep having to explain all the science or the background information needed to understand why misinformation is wrong. So it's just by exposing the fallacy of it, or just the bad logic in an argument. So that's kind of a way of, I guess, sidestepping expertise or information, which isn't necessarily the best thing. Like as a scientist, I'm pretty pro-science and want to get people to understand as much science as possible. But when you have limited opportunities, like for example, just a tweet or an infographic, sometimes doing that engaging, humorous approach can get the message across with minimal effort. That's not quite answering what you're talking about, but I think I'd need to probably have a closer look at that book.
Before we get to Carson's hand, we have a comment and a question or two in the chat here. So Catherine just notes that this seems similar to strategies we might use for teaching people how to identify false advertising, which seems like a good observation. And then Natalie asks, how do you explain to people who watch or believe unreliable news sources that are being fed fake news and opinion, or that they are being fed fake news and opinion?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard. Like one thing that I'm conscious of is we can, as communication scientists, we can run our lab experiments and show that, hey, if we tweak our model, our message a certain way and frame it with this way and just get it just delicately balanced, kind of like trying to get the antenna on a TV just positioned perfectly, you can overcome the maybe the psychological biases or the political barriers that people might have. But then they just go home and start watching Fox News and get all that misinformation, like a fire hose of falsehoods waving over them, and it will cancel out all that kind of framing and delicate messaging that you've worked on. So that challenge of the media ecosystem that people live in is huge. And I don't think I really have a comprehensive answer to that. My general answer, I think, is building their resilience to the misleading techniques used by these types of media channels can potentially inoculate them to some degree, but it's a tough ask. I'm not confident that I can say that it's certainly. I think it's important to recognize that the population is a spectrum, and you will have your rusted on hardcore, extremists who almost cannot be persuaded. It's very difficult. But then there are a lot of moderates who might kind of consume that media to a lesser degree, but also be more, and they are vulnerable to being misled, but they are also open to accusation and open to critical thinking interventions as well. So I think recognizing that we don't necessarily have to convince 100% of the population, but if we convince enough of the population, then we can get progress on an issue. So yeah, you might not change the person who watches Fox News for 10 hours a day, but you might have more success with moderates.
A version of Holly's question, she says a lot of people get information or misinformation from social media. What do you think their role is in preventing the spread of misinformation? And just to sort of spell that out, or to take it an even step further, to play with your metaphor of inoculation, we know that we have a coronavirus, and we've developed vaccines that work according to the way that the vaccine or the virus works. And we have problems. One problem is that the virus spreads virally, whereas the inoculation is, you got to get somebody's arm and you got to jab them with the the weakened the vaccine. And so the vaccine seems to be one off, and the virus itself is able to spread much more easily. So in other words, and you kind of hinted at this earlier, but it seems like you have a challenging problem where it's easy to spread misinformation, but it's hard to combat it. And you've got to go sort of one at a time, inoculate, which is, and you're always behind. Whereas I'm thinking of social media where a meme becomes viral, it spreads very fast. Can you do, and so this is my sort of framing of a question, can you use social media to virally spread inoculation? And now I'm mixing the metaphor in a way that's probably not appropriate. Anyway, take that where you want.
Yes, you can. There's this phrase that I find delightful in the inoculation literature called post-inoculation talk. What researchers have found is when you inoculate people against the counter-arguments they might encounter on a difficult, controversial topic, the researchers have found that afterwards, those people are more likely to talk about the issue with their social network, post-inoculation talk. And so, in other words, potentially the inoculation can go viral as well. You inoculate people and then they talk to other people, which inoculates them, and so on, in theory anyway. And so, and this is actually one of the big driving factors behind my work in climate change, because in climate change, while only 7% of the population are dismissive of climate science, 58% are, or maybe it was 54% now, over 50% of the population are convinced or alarmed about climate change. but most of those people don't talk about the issue with their friends and family. And the reason why they don't is because they're not aware that they're in the majority. This is a misconception called pluralistic ignorance. And they're worried that they'll encounter pushback from their cranky uncle or whoever and be made to look stupid. So inoculation empowers people to talk about controversial issues. For me, inoculating about climate misinformation is it's not about trying to change cranky uncle's mind. It's about building resilience amongst the 93% of people who are dismissive, who aren't dismissive. And it's about activating the convinced and alarmed, giving them confidence to be able to talk about the issue. And then if enough of us are talking about the issue, that builds social momentum. And also if enough of us are inoculated, and when we see misinformation in social media and we call it out, that can potentially help the misinformation from spreading.
That's really helpful. A question from Carson. I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself. Feel free to ask a question to Dr. Cook.
Hey, thank you for the talk. First of all, it was great. My question for you is, how do you deal with those who accuse you of certain wrongdoings, like the example of being accused of indoctrination? And is it frustrating to be in your position as someone who is trying to fight misinformation when there's so much misinformation going around?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my job is to, I guess, neutralize misinformation. And if I achieve that, then my job is basically to put myself out of a job. So it's kind of it's a bittersweet kind of experience that in the last 4 years, misinformation has become a way more prominent societal issue than it was when I started doing this work. So it kind of sucks to be more relevant in a way. And one thing that my research has found is that one of the biggest, and this is quantified research, right? We're actually doing machine learning research to plot the different types of misinformation. And we found that the biggest category of climate misinformation is attacks on scientists and attacks on climate science. So it's about undermining people's trust in misinformation. Now, I myself have also received a lot of attacks over the course of my career, but I know from personal experience that does take a toll on people. But I'm in kind of a unique position in that I research these kind of attacks and these types of misinformation. So it's kind of an abstraction for me at this point. It's essentially more data when I get attacked. I go, it's an interesting phenomenon. It's kind of like, it's like Tron getting sucked into the computer and playing against the games that he actually programmed, kind of thing. So, but for scientists in general, it can be quite an intimidating or concerning thing when their research or themselves personally get attacked. So what part of my work has been raising institutional awareness of this aspect of misinformation, that scientists get attacked, that the very integrity of science can come under threat when science deniers try to intimidate either universities or journals or the scientists themselves. And really the way to inoculate science against these kind of attacks is by raising scientific institutions' awareness of these techniques, so that when they happen against them, they're more aware of it and they can understand it better.
Thanks for that great question, Carson. One more question for you, Dr. Cook, before we let you go. I've been participating in a group, international group of scholars that's going under the label of Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators. It's a sort of interdisciplinary international group. One of the themes that's emerging, so they're trying to look for ways of helping teachers to address climate education in the classroom, and the sort of the feelings of depression, sadness, regret, that follow from understanding the magnitude and severity of climate change and grief. And so there's psychologists involved and social scientists. And one of the sub themes is the difference between sort of taking a logical approach and an affective approach. And I don't want to sort of embrace a dualistic sort of split that would see these as separate. You know, I'm not a fan of a Cartesian sort of worldview, but I wonder if someone, what would you say if someone said, you know, your approach is really great, but it's still sort of a logic approach. It's still pointing out informal logical fallacies and inoculating them to see the logical, you know, mistakenness of the misinformation. And is there an affective version, or maybe it's already there and maybe you're already doing it? I'm just curious of what somebody said, you're missing the affect, you're missing the emotive aspect. What would you say?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. In inoculation theory, I didn't touch on this in my actual presentation, but there are two key elements to an inoculating message: the warning of the threat of being misled and the counter arguments explaining the misleading or rhetorical techniques in the misinformation. And what the research has found is the heavy lifting in inoculating messages is the warning. It is that effective part. It's just flagging for people the threat that you may get tricked, which is really that kind of system one effective aspect, and the counter arguments being more the system two rational part of the message. So inoculation really does incorporate both effective and logical aspects, and so that's why it is important in inoculation. Yes, there is all the logic aspect to it, but you also need to just warn people of the threat of being misled, warn people that there is misinformation out there, and here is a way to protect yourself. And that does appeal to people at a, I think, a more primal level than just the kind of head knowledge of understanding different fallacies.
Well, this has been a really enjoyable conversation. You know, we'd all wish that you were able to join us here in Spokane, and but on the other hand, the pandemic has made it possible to have events like this where we have a low carbon footprint and have a great scholar here sharing the research. So thank you for taking some of your day and sharing your expertise with us. I've enjoyed skepticalscience.com for years. It's a really wonderful resource. I'm putting it again in the chat there for everybody. If you haven't checked out skepticalscience.com, highly recommend it. Cranky Uncle is a great new website as well. Dr. Greg Gordon is I think playing with using the one of those books, what is it? Climate change versus what is it called? Cranky Uncle versus climate change.
Versus climate change.
Yeah, and so and the new website. I'm excited to see they're developing some teaching materials. I'm encouraging some of the reasoning faculty in our philosophy department to see if our philosophy 101 class might make use of this. So those of you students out there who want to see this in your philosophy 101 class, email a philosophy 101 reasoning professor near you and encourage them to take this on. I think it's a great idea. If you'd like to be able to review this presentation tonight, it will appear on gonzaga.edu/ENVS events within a week or two under past events. Big thanks to Dr. Greg Gordon for having the idea to invite John Cook with us tonight. I see that your camera is on, Greg. Did you want to? You look like you're. No,
we're getting dizzy just looking at him.
I know. So if you wanted to say something, Greg, feel free. But if you're there,
thanks a lot, John. Thanks a lot, John. That was a great talk, and I liked how it sort of followed up from your presentation to the class about Cranky Uncle. The students really got a lot out of that using that book and having you join us last semester.
Yeah, thanks very much, Greg.
All right, we'll let you go, Dr. Cook. Thank you so much again for joining us, and we hope to have you to campus someday.
Yeah, hope so. Hope to visit you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.